Hello, I'm Jesse Sherritt from Muscular Dystrophy Canada, and we're here live with Maayan Ziv, the founder of AccessNow. Maayan is an entrepreneur and an advocate for accessibility and inclusion, and so we are here talking to her for National Accessibility Week. Maayan, you have an incredible story already. Can you share a little bit about how you came to AccessNow and the world of accessibility?
Yeah. First of all, thanks for having me. This is
Thanks
so
for
exciting.
joining. Yeah, it's
And
our first
welcome
live
to the
stream.
DMZ.
Thank you for having us.
We work here often out of the DMZ, and Access Now actually was very much born here because I did my master's
Okay.
at Ryerson University in digital media, and it was through that process that I actually begun building Access Now.
Amazing.
And so, I've used this wheelchair, not this specific one, but I've used a wheelchair throughout, my whole life, and just got really frustrated with not knowing if places were accessible, showing up at locations and being stuck with that, one step or three steps at the entrance, or just dealing with barriers. I was just so tired of that reality that I just felt like there has to be a better way, and if I can start working towards something that perhaps could solve this problem, just providing people with information, then that's what I'm going to do.
It's amazing.
Start it out.
So you decided to smash down all the barriers yourself.
Well, it's been kind of a journey. It started just with asking questions and talking to people and finding out, what would be the best solution for them, and started, had these ideas about, like, maybe if we used a mapping platform and people could share information, and, it just was trial and error, and eventually people, were offering support or feedback, and that's kind of how it grew.
That's amazing.
Hi, Barbara.
Hi, Barb. So, Maayan, I know you started your career as a photographer, and that's a passion of mine as well, so I really identify with that. And, I wonder how did photography play a role in you or did it play a role in, the way you shape your eye? Did that kind of draw you to these inaccessible parts of the world? And, was that something you thought of before, or did photography play a role?
It's a good question. And, sometimes people don't really make the link, but I know you're a photographer too. So,
not as good as you. Amateur.
I think it certainly did, even if I didn't realize that it did. I, as a photographer, was probably investigating spaces that people assume someone with a wheelchair wouldn't be going. So rough terrain, areas that people had forgotten about, abandoned buildings, like
Amazing.
Places that weren't accessible. And often those places were office buildings, or, if I'd show up for a gig, like I was going all kinds of places, basically, and traveling. And, whether it's for work, whether it was in my photography, whether it was, I just wanted to go out with friends, this question of, is this space going to be accessible, just kept coming up again and again and again. And I think sometimes photography offers an opportunity to look at things from a different perspective.
Yes.
And perhaps that helped frame the way that I would look at solving the problem.
So did that kind of, did this build up over time?
I'm just so excited that people are like engaging and sharing.
We have
guys.
people. Hi, thank you so much for joining us. If people are just joining now, I'm here speaking with AccessNow founder Maayan Ziv. She's talking to us about National Accessibility Week. So thank you for joining. So Maayan, we just talked a little bit about the role photography played in, kind of expanding your eye and drawing your eye to maybe some of these inaccessible places, or whether you wanted to go do street photography and it was just a pain to get to. But did you have really an aha moment where you were like, what, screw this, I'm building an app, I'm going to be the one to do this?
And
on a global
did.
scale too.
Okay, so I actually did have an aha moment, and it's funny because I never have had an aha moment before. And I don't know if I'll have one again, because it's kind of that, like, really, it's a rare thing, when you have like I know exactly what I need to do. Like, that rarely happens. But for me, it was actually the first week had ended of our master's program. And we were actually just in the room next door here. And we're like, hey, let's go out celebrating, let's go grab a drink or something. It was like the whole class, we were just talking about where we're going to go. And so, someone said, oh, like, let's go to this place that I heard about, it's not too far from here. And I had, again, that question, okay, well, if we're going to go, is it going to be accessible for me? And we'd been talking that whole week about, looking at problems in our own lives and searching for opportunity to disrupt old models or find solutions. And for me, it was kind of like I put two and two together, and this very repetitive frustration was just staring at me right in the face. I went, okay, this is the problem I'm going to solve.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously with any startup, it takes a ton of time, and most startups, fail. And so it's been a passion of love for you. But,
Sure.
How have you seen this grow over the last couple of years? And I know that, the work that you've done has raised your profile an incredible amount. You've become a huge advocate for accessibility and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
You're meeting with ministers, you're meeting with the big wigs who have opportunities to really make changes. So
Yeah.
how have you seen this kind of evolution of AccessNow, and can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's still evolving.
A bit of a whirlwind.
It's still a journey. I think the first moment where things really changed was the day that we launched. Until then it had been a project that I'd been working on quietly. I'd been speaking to people or, asking for help or reaching out to people who might be able to offer some kind of advice, just building that network. I spoke to people, from the disability community. I spoke to people who worked with different charitable organizations. I spoke to people who worked in startups, people who had run businesses, who had failed or had succeeded, people in government. Like, I reached out to everyone. But until then, it was very quiet. Hey, Jason. I'm going to keep saying hi whenever, because this is still the coolest thing to me. But it'd been quiet, and it was just one-on-one conversations. And then, finally, it started in September, and by August, I had something that, felt comfortable enough to share with the world.
Wait, you started in August, and by September you had something?
By September, I started in September and went until August. So
okay.
Almost a full year.
All right, I was thinking the world's fastest entrepreneur.
No, and so we released a prototype, kind of a very basic beta version of AccessNow, just kind of scheduled in time for the Pan Am Games, which was a milestone that I was set on hitting. We weren't going to be late for that. We wanted to make sure that that would come out then. And within, a week or so, just the response from community, the response from the media, really opened up what I was doing from it being a very one-to-one conversation to, this is something that people are excited about. This is something that people are contributing to already and putting their faith, in just sharing. So we went from, I think when AccessNow initially launched, I kind of had mined my own memory and several of my friends to put down as much information as they could that they knew on the map. So when we launched, it wouldn't be empty.
Yeah.
And we went, I think, from like 200 to like 800 plus, in a couple days, which to me was really exciting because I thought we'd have to go really slowly and no one would know about it. And I'd have to reach out and beg people to share. But, we did Toronto Star front page. We did radio and news on TV. It was a flurry of, attention. And that really inspired me to keep going because I saw the need and it was so vocal. And that's where, from there, it's just been a journey of connecting with people who can help, people who can share, and we'll see where it goes.
It's amazing. And what I really like about AccessNow too is it's all crowdsourced. You have people around the world. Just quickly, do you know who the furthest person away to have downloaded it is? Do you have people?
We've had, so I would say like the majority of the places shared are either in Canada and sometimes the States. We're very mapped out in Toronto and in Ontario. We're beginning to see pockets of information pop up, in Vancouver, Halifax, like major cities in Canada. And then we also, I think in terms of reach, we've reached Australia.
Wow.
We've reached different parts of Europe. And that's really exciting. One day all of a sudden I open the map and there's a notification and, we have our first pin in China, and it's like, wow, I don't know how we've got there, but I think it's really just through connection and social media and the ability for people to share and be connected globally.
You've developed a global network. I mean, that's all with kind of a singular focus, which is just...
And we've just begun, too.
Yeah,
so,
you're just starting.
Like my goal is to get AccessNow to the point where when you open the app, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you have, enough information that can guide you about, what's accessible, where, what you specifically need. So if you're looking for a restaurant and you need an accessible washroom, and you're in Paris, well, AccessNow can help you find one.
That's
that's where I want to be at. So we'll get there.
Amazing.
Hi, everyone who's joining.
Hello. So I got an email this week from Minister Qualtrough, who was announcing, National Accessibility Week and kind of, sharing some of the hashtags and ads and, to get involved on social media.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things I noticed was, there was two hashtags they were working with. One was Accessible Canada,
mm-hmm.
and the other was AccessAbility.
Right.
And I just wanted to ask you, what's the distinction there for you? How do you interpret those two different messages?
Yeah. So National Accessibility Week is kind of this week, all week long, and it's kind of the national effort to start really raising the profile about accessibility in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And what I like about the word accessibility and accessability is that it really does encompass everyone. And it's not really about disability specifically.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about being able to access and looking at the abilities in people. And so I think that accessibility is kind of a cool spin on that. We've been playing with that a little bit through social media. And, Accessible Canada is kind of the umbrella that they've put on the legislation that they're working towards. So it used to be called, a Canadians with Disabilities Act, and now, the language is really about creating an Accessibility Act or legislation about an accessible Canada.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned just, I really like that accessibility
Yeah.
hashtag too. I think it's great. And, it's something that everyone can kind of rally around. And my next question, I just kind of wanted to ask you, how do you drive more people to the fight for inclusion and accessibility? How do you kind of bring in a wider network of allies? When you're pitching it, how do you tell people, get involved with this?
For sure, yeah. That's the number one thing that I have to do all the time.
I'm sure you do.
And, it varies. So it really depends on who I'm speaking to. When I'm speaking to people within the disability community, it's not so much about explaining the problem, because we get it,
yes.
Right? I can't get to this place because there's a barrier. Yeah, we've all been there. We experienced that all. And so it's not so much about education, more so about involvement and understanding the power and the impact that we all have and have an ability to contribute that could really build this into a resource that benefits everyone. Versus, often I go into conversations or meetings or I'm doing a pitch and it's with people who have never thought about accessibility ever. It's not like I'm perhaps the first person with a disability who's ever pitched them anything in their life, which is crazy to me. But, there's a big, there's just a gap. And, AccessNow very much started with the need for action, about flipping awareness on its head and saying, let's act and create awareness that way. Mm-hmm. And then there are these ripples that kind of come off of it, and education is one of them. So often before, I can convince anyone to add a pin, they have to understand the problem. They have to understand why it matters.
Yes.
And so depending on the context, there are tons of awareness activities that we do, like map missions, to get people involved and actually understand what it really means in a tangible way to experience barriers.
Yeah. No, and you just kind of touched on, the next question I wanted to ask you, and that was around, people who are hearing about it for the first time. And, you said there's this process of education, and you kind of, may have not had someone with a disability pitch them for the first time, and so how do you explain what inclusion and what accessibility is to these people? How do you, what do you break it down?
So what I like to do is usually start out personal.
Okay.
I like to share an example from my own life, a place that I've gone or something that I've done and where I experienced a barrier. If we have a slideshow, often I'm showing pictures of what that's like. And
I think you shared a story with me the first time we met up for coffee.
It's possible.
About having to go across the street and, people directing you all over the city to find an accessible washroom or something.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I've got tons of those stories.
So does that make the slideshow? Or?
I don't know if our story makes a slideshow, but it's out there. Yeah. So yeah, it starts with a relatability. It starts with everyone's been in a situation where they wanted to do something and there's been something in their way. But not everyone has been in a position where that is because of a physical barrier. That is there because, perhaps the world didn't realize that would stop people from accessing, or that would prevent people from feeling included. Everyone wants to feel like they're part of something. And so when you get to the point where you realize, like, wow, this person literally just wants to go eat a slice of pizza and experiencing a barrier, that's simple as one step, people totally get that, like, that's ridiculous. And then it becomes something as simple as, like, well, if I can share one pin next time I go out for a slice of pizza, then maybe I can contribute to something bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it's the power of community, and with the internet and crowdsourcing, that stuff is easier to do than ever. So it's incredible.
Well, it shouldn't be the burden of like one person or one organization that has to take care of everything for everyone.
Yes.
That is the old model of saying they make everything accessible. Realistically, here in Ontario, when we have, the AODA that says that by 2025, the province will be accessible, well, I would prefer not to wait until 2025, and I'm not even sure that we'll get there then. So, instead of waiting on others, if every person contributes even just one pin or two pins or shares it with someone, we work to create like this grassroots community movement, which I think is actually much more powerful than any kind of organized legislation.
I couldn't agree more, and that's one of the things, joining the Muscular Dystrophy Canada team is what I've really come to notice is just how involved this organization is in communities across Canada. Mm-hmm. So, if you were speaking to people with neuromuscular disorders, what would you tell them to get involved, with you? Or, in a different domain, if they want to get involved in another accessibility or, fight for inclusion?
Well, there's a lot to be done, and I think that everyone kind of has a part to play, whether they do have a disability or not, and it can be as simple as sharing a pin on AccessNow, but it can also be, looking at your own community or looking at something in your own circles and thinking, how can I contribute to making change here? Mm-hmm. So if there is, let's say, an activity that hasn't been promoted in an inclusive way, it's just vocalizing and saying, hey, have you considered changing your language around the way that you're speaking about this? Or, hey, have you considered sharing information on your website that would allow people to know whether or not it's accessible or not? Or, there's so many ways, and often it just begins with conversations.
Using your voice and not being afraid. Yeah, that's great advice. I think just about anyone in any kind of domain is, find a way to get involved. And so my last question, I don't want to take too much of your time. I know you're a busy woman. So with AccessNow and, this global network you're building, obviously, as it begins to scale, you're going to have a whole bunch of new challenges. And what do you really see as your challenges moving forward?
Well, I think one of the largest challenges right now for us is to be able to reach people who don't think that they need to or can be involved.
Okay.
There's kind of this assumption that, unless you use a wheelchair or unless you have a physical disability, you're not someone who can help or contribute. it's almost like they don't think that they're part of the club.
Yeah.
And, you know, I want to get to the point where every person not only realizes that they can be part of creating a more inclusive and accessible world, but also that they feel that there is a certain level of responsibility for them to do so.
Yes.
You know, so whether you are an employer or whether you work in government or, you know, it shouldn't be that you're pointing to the person with a disability and saying, well, that person will figure it out, or that other office over there, you know. So I think everybody has to look at what they do with an accessibility lens and figure out if, you know, their space is really accessible or if their technology is really accessible. And it starts with asking those questions. And I think often people are fearful. They don't want to, or they are not sure, or they don't want to offend, and so they just leave it.
Yeah.
But until we get to a point where everyone realizes that actually we all benefit, then, you know, it's always going to be this afterthought, and we really got to get away from that.
Yeah, we got to be out ahead of things and,
Absolutely.
you know, driving the change.
Well, yeah.
Couldn't agree more, Maayan. And, you know, sometimes it takes too much time to wait for the government to catch up. So I'm so glad that there's people like you that are pushing things forward.
Yeah, and we can work with government. It's not that government...
Definitely.
You know, I think obviously they have a very important role to play in this. But, you know, having advice and consultations from people with disabilities or people with lived experience can actually help move it forward in a more productive way.
Well, I'm glad we have you to do that, you know, and I invite everyone else watching today and people who will be watching in the future to, you know, download Maayan's app, AccessNow, and get involved and, you know, start tagging or pinning places.
Yeah.
Pinning?
Yeah, pinning places.
Pinning places.
Yeah.
So, Maayan, before we log off, you know, National Accessibility Week, you have a last thought to share with the audience?
A last thought.
Any powerful quotes or, you know, something that keeps you inspired?
Interesting. I don't know. I feel like what's cool about this concept is that it's national. This National Accessibility Week, I think it's weird to me a little bit because there are so many different versions. Like, I feel like every day I hear a different version of an accessibility thing. And I want us to get away from like, oh, this has to be my own thing or nobody can be part of it. Mm-hmm. I think we have to get into this understanding of the power of community.
Yes.
And so when we talk about National Accessibility Week, I think it's not, you know, one person's job to make sure that everyone knows what that is. You know, it's everyone's job. And so share things, you know, that matter to you about accessibility. You know, raise your voice, you know, put things on social media, connect with others, find resources and put those out into the world. And often, you know, through the power of social media, which I've learned in the last 2 years has been one of the strongest tools for us, there is so much we can do to make sure that people who don't yet know about something like National Accessibility Week can know about it. So share.
Amazing advice. Yeah, I think that's what we need to be doing. Maybe, I guess, before we sign off here, we'll check if there's any questions coming in. Do we have anything from anyone? I see a few people. If you have questions before we head off, you type them in there in the comments, and Maayan will be happy to respond. Otherwise, we'll let her get back to work because she's very busy. Well, thank you to everyone who joined us today. It was a real pleasure. And thank you, Maayan, and best of luck with all your ventures in the future.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, thanks, guys. This has been fun.
Happy National Accessibility Week to everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks.